Boom, here we go. Season 3 is now kicking off. Shradha, it's been a long time. How are you feeling?
It's great. It's been a long season break, but it's so good to be back, Rupert. I love our show, and I hope you are doing well.
I'm
We are
doing very
battling
well.
cold in Northeast. It's so cold. It's good for polar bears, I guess, but not good for us.
It's good for the bears. It's I'd just say in London it's just grey and grey. I haven't seen the sun for a very long time. Over Christmas I didn't manage to get to New Zealand. I went to New Zealand in October and got some sun, and that's been it. So that you can see it. I'm turning blue. The lack of rays coming through. Um, and anything exciting in your world, Shradha, before we introduce our guest?
I think it's as you say, Rupert, living the dream. It's fantastic. I got a chance to go back to home, India, this December and celebrate some family milestones, so which was fantastic. And now I'm back.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.
I am so excited to welcome our guest for this podcast, new season, Julian Chender. Welcome to our show. And I have been following your journey since a very long time. I think you are of 15,000 followers that you have on LinkedIn. I'm one of them.
Okay.
And very impressive career in org design. Not many people uh, get to do that because org design is such a coveted topic. There are not many opportunities, but you have been able to navigate your entire career in this amazing world of org design, both as internal consultant and as an external consultant. And so we're so happy and excited to know more about you, and you're a passion fellow for this topic. So welcome to this show, and
Thank you so
welcome to
much.
our
It's a
podcast.
pleasure to be here. I've been a big listener, so it's nice to be here with you in person.
Fantastic. So we start with tell me something about yourself. And we would love
Who
to
is
hear
Julian?
about, yes.
So the thing that I think is most defining about me is that I'm born and raised in New York, which has its pros and its cons, especially when you're dealing with clients. So right now I have a client in Minneapolis. I was just there, and speaking of weather, it was minus 30 Fahrenheit. So I think my lips are permanently chapped as a result. Um, but Minnesota has a culture of niceness, and I have a culture of directness, if not borderline aggression. Being born and raised in New York. So it's really interesting to do cross-cultural work within the United States as a New Yorker. And some clients, I have heard every client say you're an acquired taste, and I say if 40% of people can acquire it, I think I have a business.
Love that. Love that. So, what got you stumbled into org design world?
So I graduated in the lovely economy of 2009 from undergrad. I was a history major. I studied modern European history and Jewish history. And so my marketable skills in an economy that was on a huge downturn were reading, writing, and academic research. And
Mm.
uh, I mean, to my huge surprise at that point, there were no jobs with those qualifications as their main desires.
You are an acquired taste, Julian.
um, so I wanted to help people. My minor was psychology and peace and conflict studies. So I wanted to help people. I thought I'll be a therapist. I'm 22 years old. I go to social work school. I get placed with treatment refractory schizophrenics on a locked ward. And I say to myself, I am too young and too immature to do any of this. And I started my first business when I quit social work school, which was tutoring for college entrants, which in New York is a big business because if you're not tutored in the private school world of New York, you're at a disadvantage. So I did that for a few years, and then I thought, New York is too much. I had had enough. So I moved to Washington, D.C. for 7.5 years and worked in the federal government. And it was there that I discovered organization development and organization design. It was actually not there. It was there that I started learning it, but it was actually at a conference in Halifax, Nova Scotia called the Authentic Leadership and Action Institute, which was a mix of Tibetan Buddhism and dialogic organization development from about 1999 to probably ran to about 2014. And I was there in 2013. And I said, this is what I want to do. I want to create change at scale. So being a therapist was never actually going to work because it was at the individual level. And even though I am an executive coach and I do use executive coaching in my practice, it's in the concept of behavior at scale, which is why I love org design, because we're shaping behavior at scale. So I got my master's in org development and ended up working at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, which you might have heard of because they're the ones who created the COVID vaccines with Moderna and Pfizer. I ran leadership development, team development, and kind of enterprise strategy work there. And so I got to work with Tony Fauci and some of his directs on how are we responding to Ebola in Africa, how are we responding to Zika in the Caribbean, which were, what I call the warm-ups to COVID, because it got us moving. And that's where I learned a really important lesson that has served me as an org designer, which is that the culture of the organization is usually related to its product. So curing infectious disease is the product of this organization. Infectious disease is fast. So they would always compare themselves to the National Cancer Institute, which sat in the building next door. Cancer is slow. Cancer research can go on for years. But when we need a vaccine for Ebola in Sierra Leone and Liberia, we need it now. And so the culture was what we called cowboy scientists. When there was an outbreak, they didn't say, oh no, they said, let me buy a plane ticket to where that outbreak is and start gathering samples. So all of the leadership development was tailored to that. And all of the strategy work was tailored to that. And so that was a really great lesson. And then I had the unfortunate need to leave because I fell in love with a woman in New York. And I thought, oh my God, am I really moving back to New York? And the minute I got back to New York, my stress level went up 30% just by being in New York and being in the hustle and bustle. But I loved it. And I loved being back. And I have loved being back in New York. And that's when my external career started. So I did a little bit of workplace strategy and kind of found my way into, if I'm designing physical space for collaboration, what about the unseen organization that goes in that space? When we're thinking about how people collaborate, there's so much more than just hot desking or activity-based working. And that's when I found org design as my passion. So I was an org developer, I was a consultant, and it was then that I zeroed in on the invisible, the organization. And I found Amy Cates on LinkedIn, and I sent her a somehow compelling enough note that she was willing to meet for coffee. And I spent $8.25 on a cup of coffee and a croissant for her. And it is the biggest return on investment I've ever had. Because she spent the next year coaching me in her methodology. And then when Cates Kessler was acquired by Accenture, I was in the first round of external hires into the acquisition. So I was neither Cates Kessler nor Accenture, which gave me both perspective and a bit of an outsider status. So 3.5 years at Accenture, and then now 6 months in 11A Collaborative doing what I was doing for the Fortune 500 for social impact organizations.
And Julian, before we jump into that and why you made that move, and I'm just fascinated if you could just double click on the culture follows the product and how you weave that into your org design work.
So I think there's a great example of this. It's a government example, but I have a friend who worked with the Transportation Security Administration here in the United States, the ones who do the airport screening. And he worked with them for years doing conflict resolution. And they were a high conflict culture that had a lot of gatekeeping. And then you think about, what do? They gatekeep the airport. So then the gatekeeping all of a sudden made sense. And he could say, this gatekeeping culture isn't a problem. It's a result of your product. Now, when he went to work with the air marshals who all brought their guns to the session, that was a different culture and a different situation. But I think of organizations that somehow what you're selling or what you're putting out into the world is going to impact how you behave. And
So
yeah, go ahead.
sorry to jump in. So if a client is looking to enter a new market, so let's say it's a services business that wants to create a product, or it's a product business that wants. So you've got an adjunct. The strategy is to have a new product line. Does that mean that you have to then sit back and say, well, what kind of culture, therefore, would need to support that, and therefore let's be deliberate about trying to think about that?
Absolutely, and I think that's where the organizational capabilities come in. Those muscles that we need. I've been in talks with an arts research organization that wants to start a consulting division. And they're all ex-McKinsey people, but they're all ex-McKinsey research. And they're trying to start this consulting division, and it's like this research muscle, this like productization is somehow holding back or delaying the start of this consultative side. And so you need different organizational muscles for the different products. And as they build that, and as I meet with them to build that, it's kind of interesting to watch them on their journey as they start to think outside of what they're used to.
You've made a big move.
I have.
Wow.
I left a very solid corporate career. It happened because I was working in the Fortune 10 in pharmaceutical. And I was doing the best work of my career in org design. It was a lot of governance work, which is really fun because that's where org development and org design really come together. And I felt so proud of the work. And then I was reading in the New York Times and the Guardian that there was yet another lawsuit against this company for pushing opioids. And yet another, and yet another. And eventually they ended up changing their name to get rid of those search results. And I said to myself, do I want to do really good work to help the rich get richer off the back of whatever? Or do I want to do it to help people in the world do it better? Doing good work in the world do it better. Where do I want to put my efforts? Because the efforts are similar. At that point, I thought they were the same, and I was wrong. But at that point, I thought I could just lift and shift my practice. And when I had that realization, I ended up moving into doing a project with Accenture Development Partnerships, which is their international NGO arm, which works at cost. And I did a project for a 6,000 person education organization in California. And I loved it. I said, I'm doing org design and it's for people. And like the results are more kids get better education. Now that's the dream. But with the way Accenture was going and the way big consulting was going, that wasn't going to be a real possibility. And so it was either go back to kind of working with a company who develops paint thinners to do their org design, which is not the most interesting or impactful product, or do my own thing. And I said to myself, I got to take the leap. And it's been quite an interesting response. Business has been better than expected. But the translation part from corporate to social impact and nonprofit has been a challenge. And I'm actually working with a colleague on a presentation for the Org Design Forum on the translation work that we've been doing. Because so much of what we understand naturally from a corporate world that I picked up at Accenture is not just not language that's used in the social impact space, but not concepts that exist. So the idea of a value chain doesn't exist in the social impact space. They certainly have one, but the concept isn't there.
You mean that the people don't understand the concept?
Yes. It's not just that they don't have the name value chain and they call it something else. They don't have the concept of a value chain.
Yeah. But there is a value chain.
Of course there is.
And so you're helping them to you're bringing this language, and not just the language, these concepts. Like, there's a value chain. Like, what value are you bringing? And you might be an NGO, you might be third sector, but you have a client or a customer. There's someone you are serving, and in some way.
And there's some sort of funding that you need to get from the back, and you need to productize it into a program that you then deliver to a client. But to them, they are doing good work in the world. And that's what they've been doing since they were 21 years old, and that's all they know. And so I'm this outsider again. So I keep finding myself in these outsider positions. Coming into Accenture, I was seen as the academic because I had published and I didn't do big consulting. And then I kind of found my way. And as soon as I found my way, I left and did something else that I thought I was going to fit into just seamlessly. And now I'm the outsider again. So really working on making these translations of these concepts has been the challenge and also the opportunity, because I think the sector is in dire need of org design. But when they hear org design, they don't know that word. They know capacity building. They know org development from the point of view of anything that has to do with non-program org. So any corporate functions is org development, which isn't how I think of org development, but that's their language. So I think of now, what is the org design that we need? And the calls I get are restructuring calls. And I translate then restructuring into org design. And that's where I was able to, one of the first things I did was rewrite the STAR model questions that Amy, Greg, and Michelle published in Network Scaled and Agile to be nonprofit or social impact specific. So instead of how do we compete in our markets, it's how do we increase our impact? And all of a sudden they go, yeah, we need to, that's what we're trying to do, but we need to do it but the structure's not working. And then, okay, well, what is the connection between strategy and structure? And then we're off to the races. But there's that initial pickup of wait, strategy and structure go together.
Very interesting. Julian, I'm now curious. Would you think that the whole idea about culture follows the product needs to be thought through differently as well in nonprofit sector?
Absolutely. It is. So I'm working with a social justice organization right now. Civil rights, hard time to be in this field in the US. They're on the defense. And when we think about I'm working with someone who, and this is my theory right now, which is always staff higher than myself, be my own junior. And so I found an old professor of mine from graduate school who specializes in social justice organizations from an org development point of view, doesn't know org design very well. And I bring the design and she brings incredible industry knowledge and incredible facilitation skills and incredible coaching skills. And what she said to me was, okay, here's this organization. They're all advocates. A lot of them are lawyers. A lot of them are looking to pass bills on the Hill, or at least were when there was a favorable Congress. They're advocating for change, which means the way they're going to want to design their organization is to advocate for themselves and their teams. And the minute we got to org models, that advocacy came out. And all of a sudden there's, well, I think this because this is what I do. And I was able to understand it not as a personal thing for them, because there are organizations where, you want to maintain your job and you want to maintain what you do, but it was they're advocating for their department, they're advocating for their people, and they're also looking to advocate for the people below them because they're used to working to advance marginalized groups, and the people below them are to them marginalized because they're below them. So they're advocating for these whole teams, which I had never seen before. I'd seen executives advocate for their own positions, absolutely. But to advocate for a department or a team or or the people. What about, Jane, who is my, lowest level employee? What's going to happen to her? And I'm like, that's a question. That's a question, because they're advocates for the marginalized. And once I could understand that, then it was like, oh, let's just let this play out. So social justice is advocacy. Direct service is rushed. I mean, direct service is, we need to get it out the door. We need to help these people. We need to do everything we can. And that's a lot about working overtime, doing more with less. So there's an organization I worked with who does post-incarceration employment. And that culture was a lot about, it's never enough because there's more people we need to serve. So there's always more people that we need to serve. So how do we need to be bigger? We need to grow. But there's no plateau to rest. There's no enough is enough, or good job along the way.
And Julian, so that example, because everyone's advocating for the people below them and people. So when you try and get them to understand value chains and the work that we're doing, and therefore what roles and positions do we need to do that work? So abstract yourself away from the people and you and your team. How is that in that environment versus, say, the private sector, or is that just like impossible?
It's not impossible. It requires naming. And my colleague said, look, I know you're all advocates, and I've worked with advocates for the last 30 years. So I see, because that's why I hire up, because she could say that. I couldn't say that, but because I don't have the lived experience, but she had that lived experience. So she could say to them, what came up in the assessment report was this kind of jockeying and not a standardized approach, but everyone gets a little bit of whatever they want to get and whatever they can get. And that's what we're doing here. We're living out the assessment report. And they go, oh, well, we don't want to do that anymore. And then all of a sudden it flips within 30 seconds.
So calling it out, recognizing that, saying this is what's happening.
So much of this work is just naming what's happening in the room.
Interesting. So the culture is dependent on now the value and the impact that you're trying to create, rather than just the product that you're trying to build.
That's what we're hoping. That's what we're hoping. It's yet to be determined.
Very cool. This is fascinating, because I don't think I have met enough practitioners out there who are now starting to focus only on the nonprofit sector, which is so different from like for-profit sector. And I had a very short stint of myself in federal, and I could see the difference, because there is no P&L that you are tracking against with, and that creates a lot of challenges. So as you are thinking about this, like, what is your good looks like in these? Like, when we wrap up, it's like, many a times it's how many people that you let go, how much productivity you increased.
Right.
Like, there are so tangible, you've done this in Accenture, there's so many tangible metrics that we track towards. And I think our listeners would be very interested in knowing that what are then the metrics that we can track when those are not the metrics.
And this is a great question. I'm actually in the process of certifying for B Corp, and they want to.
I love that.
They want to know this too. They want to know how I track my impact. And there are two ways to do it. One that I found really important in the nonprofit sector is client satisfaction. And simply because it's a relational field. It's a highly, highly relational field. So them feeling content and happy at the end goes a lot farther than, cost cutting or value case or anything. Them feeling like they went through a process where they got to work together and develop a new thing that they're excited about. To me, that's level 1 success. Level 2 success is then their impact. So whatever their desired impact is. For instance, I'm working with a corporate foundation now that is narrowing its desired impact, but trying to go deeper. So it's about getting tech to teens was the kind of original strategy. Let's improve the life of teens from areas of concentrated poverty by bringing tech centers. And now it's, well, that's not enough. Drop in tech centers where they can learn how to do Adobe and learn how to use a podcast studio and all of that. That's not enough. We need to do economic mobility. All of a sudden, there's a new horizon. So if we think about McKinsey, one of them actually asked me about McKinsey's Three Horizon models because she got an MBA. And she says, so how does the Three Horizon model work here? And I said, your third horizon is new impact. And then, so you're going into economic mobility as your third horizon. And then advocating for a world in the United States where you don't need a 4-year degree to get a quality tech job. You could get a certification, you could get a 2-year degree. That advocacy is also your horizon 3. So thinking to them about where are they going and how do they make that impact over time, that's a lot harder to measure, and it's really hard to take credit for, from my point of view. But I always love when my clients succeed and get to where they want to go. And if they want to call up a reference and say, Julian helped us get here, I'm not going to say no.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good it's good to be mindful about these, because these can be applicable for profit sectors as well. It's just that we don't apply that kind of a mindset when we're doing, so we fall back on cost cutting and productivity and utilization and whatnot.
I'd probably argue that the leading organizations do, because the leading organizations understand
Yes,
how they create value, and profit or revenue generation is a lagging indicator of success.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so,
Yes.
if Amazon famously say we obsess about the customer, and so then you obsess about net promoter score, and then you obsess around what drives
Yes.
a higher net promoter score. As an example, what activities do we need to do, and how do we need to build the moats to win in this market so we can increase that, because that's going to lead to maybe higher price, higher
Yeah.
retention, higher referenceability, and therefore the knock-on effect. And if people are just always trying to optimize the lagging, which is profitability, then that's easy. Just cut cost and just restructure. And guess what? That's the easiest thing on this planet to do is to exit cost.
Right.
Yes.
But
Create a system that's going to generate value.
Sorry to talk over you, but this is actually a blog I wrote on Sunday when I was in Minnesota a day early because of weather. I went to a coffee shop and just wrote a blog about downsizing by design, because so many nonprofits right now, with cost cutting from philanthropy and the government, are facing the need to downsize. And you can cut costs, but when you cut costs, you cut impact. So how are you going to rationalize that strategy pivot for a cut cost with the downsizing? Whereas if that's thinking about the leading indicator, we need to maybe narrow our focus. We maybe need to do fewer centers. We maybe need to go deeper with this, but and even for nonprofits, here's some of the things is when you're talking about funding streams, they don't always have the big cost center in headcount, or they don't always get a lot out of cutting headcount. A lot of them need to and are doing that now, but I don't believe that that's always the answer. In the corporate world, it's very easy for Meta to say we're going to cut 5% across the board and keep delivering the same product, and that 5% we're going to do low performers, and fine, that's just across the board. But that across the board doesn't work in nonprofits, because you can't cut across the board and then think you're still delivering the same level of service and program to your constituents, because you're working on that shoestring budget already. So if your funding is cut, how are you actually downsizing the holistic organization?
Yeah. But also, as you said, are we going to narrow our focus? So what is the strategic decision that you're making?
Right.
Yes.
And then what's the follow-on effect? And that's a way. And just the cut across the board, we need to cut 20%. So just doing 20% everywhere, you're going to be cutting into muscle everywhere.
Exactly.
as opposed to saying we're going to reduce 100% over here, and that's really painful, but it's a deliberate thing, and we're keeping our capability in this spot because that's it's a strategic question then, and I think tying it back, and that's where all too often people just get confused. It all follows on from that strategy, and I think what you're doing, Julian, is helping people understand what is the strategy, and then this is the implication for the org design.
Right, exactly. I couldn't say it better, Rupert, because I have an organization now that is cutting 100% of one department because it doesn't serve the strategy as the strategy needs to adapt at the moment. But it's hiring in other places, even though it's cost cutting.
Perfect. Yeah.
And that's the right thing to do.
Right.
Exactly. Yep.
So unfortunately, time always flies. As Morpheus said in The Matrix, time's always against us. So, Julian, we always end with two questions: one tool or one thing that our listeners can take away, one thing practical, and one trap.
Yeah, so the practical thing for me that I'm really proud of in my first 6 months as a solopreneur is spending the extra money to staff senior people and to be my own junior. And so I would say people at my level who are not the world's best, but good enough, get the people who are the world's best. Spend the money and do pay them more than they're worth and do more of the work than they do. Because
I have to say, Julian, I've never heard anyone say this before. It's very interesting because the sort of, what do you call it? The normal wisdom would be hire a junior that can do your PowerPoint, who can do the churning of it. That as you said before we went on, that's what everyone advises you to do.
Yes.
And you're doing the opposite of that.
Yes.
I mean, even though we're out of time, can you just triple click and just help? Because there might be a lot of people who are setting up their own businesses or thinking things through, just to help bring this to life a tiny bit more.
I think about the fact that I'm 30 and there are people who've been doing this for as long. I'm 38 and there are people who've been doing this for as long as I've been alive. And if not exactly what I'm doing, they've been doing the industry. They've been doing the type of work. They've been working around this. And why not get that wisdom now? And why not get that wisdom instead of by, a phone call mentoring, by actually doing the work with them and watching them in front of the client and working with them and having them give you feedback and you give, the thing that they like is that I offer org design. They don't have that. They don't know that, so a lot of them. And then they're the ones where there's a big org design project where I'm like, I need the best org designers. And I want to pay top dollar for that because I really want to knock this out of the park. And I also am still learning. I see myself as very much still learning. So if I can get in winning the work and paying someone else, I'm still getting paid to learn. So I see it as still getting paid to learn, but instead of having all the stress of the entire project on my head, on my shoulders, and having to manage a junior, I'd rather be churning on the PowerPoint.
Or you will have Copilot do that for you.
Yeah.
But I think it takes an amazing amount of vulnerability and maturity to do that. So thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate it. What would you call a trap?
Okay, the trap is going in thinking that you're starting from scratch, especially in nonprofits, because nonprofits have a higher rate and a higher rate of holding on to organizational trauma. It's there. And so a lot of what I do as a history student, like I think, my first learning about this was studying history in undergrad, is to do what I stole from Weisbord and Janoff from the Future Search, is the timeline. From the beginning of this organization to now, what are the big moments in the organization's life, in your life, and in the world? And we see then the trauma spikes, or what I call trauma snags. And usually those are unresolved. So
what's interesting, Julian, I think you've just given us another tool for avoiding the trap, which is when you go through information memorandum. So if you're raising money, one of the slides you always put into your pitch deck is the history, and you have all the key moments. And some people have those key moments, and they have, what's happening in the marketplace, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting is you're saying actually build the same thing before you do your org design, so you've got an understanding. So you're not pretending like this stuff hasn't happened, and that is going to enable you to avoid all sorts of, and getting people to reflect on that journey and be proud of that journey as well.
Yes. So
just because what got you here might not get you into the future, but let's at least celebrate.
So if I could give two very quick examples, one nonprofit had lost funding by like 50% of their funding 10 years before, and had laid off 50% of people just overnight. And that had never been told to me. And when we get to the org design, everyone's terrified that we're about to lay off 50% of the organization. And I didn't know that until they put it on the board. And then we could talk about it and say, no, we're growing. This is because there's more money flowing. Like, let's get this going. And so we missed that trauma snag. In another one, I show up and they look at me sideways. And I say, okay, this is great. The senior team loved me. We contracted for strategy and org design, and the entire staff is looking at me sideways because they had been restructured 4 times in 6 years.
Wow.
And I didn't know that.
Just asking the question, how many times have you gone through an org design in the life?
We spent the first 2 months of that work getting through that historical trauma, because they had been fighting each other. They had been fighting against each other's departments because your department got more than they had been fighting each other, and they had been fighting the system. And I was seen as the bad guy because I'm here to fix it again. And once we could get that trust, now now they're saying, oh, we want to work together. We want to build something new. And it makes the work a lot easier.
Amazing.
I would argue that this is very true for many of the for-profits organization as well. And
everywhere,
they all have this history and baggage. And that's why we say that org design is like designing cities. You can never start on a flat plane.
Yeah.
It will always be building on the old buildings and the ruins, and then you create new shiny new buildings. But you have to, honor them. You have to honor the old buildings as well.
Right. The historical society of that city has to be part of your org design.
Yes. Yes. Well, it was amazing pleasure to have you and learn from you and hear amazing journey that you have had, Julian. So thank you so much once again to be our guest and sharing your journey with us. And Rupert, thank you as always.
Thank you, Shradha. Julian, true pleasure. And good luck with your work, because it's important work you're doing, so keep it going.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. I really appreciate it.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.